Hello. The U.S. Vice President's visit to the South Caucasus is not a ceremonial diplomatic stop. It signals a quiet but meaningful shift in how Washington is repositioning itself across Eurasia. For an American audience, the core question is not about regional symbolism. It is practical. Does this move expand U.S. influence at a sustainable cost, or does it risk drawing the United States into another complex geopolitical arena with unclear long-term commitments? To understand why this trip matters, we have to zoom out. The South Caucasus, the region that includes Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, sits at the crossroads of Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia. For years, it was treated in Washington as a secondary theater. That perception is changing. Today, the region is emerging as a critical node in the competition over trade routes, energy flows, and political influence across Eurasia. For Europe, the South Caucasus has become increasingly important as part of alternative transport and energy corridors linking European markets with Asia. As traditional routes have become politically sensitive or unstable, policymakers in Brussels and other European capitals have looked for diversified connections that reduce vulnerability. The Caucasus sits at the center of this search. Stability in the region now has direct economic implications for European supply chains and energy security. This is where American interests intersect. By increasing diplomatic engagement in the South Caucasus, Washington is not simply supporting regional stability. It is positioning itself within the infrastructure of future Eurasian connectivity. In strategic terms, this is about influence over corridors that shape economic geography. Control over logistics and political alignment along these routes can translate into long-term leverage in global competition. At the same time, the United States is pursuing a model of engagement that differs from the large-scale military commitments of the past 2 decades. Washington is moving toward what could be described as low-cost containment, strengthening regional partners through diplomacy, economic cooperation, and targeted security assistance, rather than deploying major troop formations. The goal is to shape the strategic environment without assuming the burden of direct occupation or nation-building. From a budgetary and political perspective, this approach is attractive. American public opinion has grown skeptical of open-ended foreign interventions. Policymakers are under pressure to protect U.S. interests while limiting exposure to prolonged conflicts. Supporting regional actors who can balance competing powers locally appears to offer a middle path between isolation and overextension. However, this strategy carries its own risks. The South Caucasus is not an empty geopolitical space. It is a region where Russian, Iranian, Turkish, and increasingly Chinese interests overlap. Any visible expansion of American influence inevitably triggers reactions from these actors. Even if U.S. engagement is framed as economic and diplomatic, it is interpreted through a security lens by neighboring powers. For Russia, the Caucasus has long been associated with its near-abroad security perimeter. Moscow views external involvement in the region as a potential challenge to its strategic depth. Iran, which borders the South Caucasus, is sensitive to shifts in the balance of power near its northern frontier. Turkey maintains its own active regional agenda, combining economic ties with security partnerships. China, meanwhile, sees the region primarily through the lens of infrastructure investment and trade connectivity. In this crowded environment, the United States must calibrate its actions carefully. Increased engagement can strengthen American influence and support partners seeking diversified relationships. But it can also raise the risk of entanglement in regional disputes that are historically complex and politically volatile. For American taxpayers and voters, the concern is not abstract. The question is whether incremental commitments today could evolve into expectations of deeper involvement tomorrow. Another layer of complexity comes from the broader U.S. relationship with Iran. Rising tensions between Washington and Tehran add strategic weight to any American activity along Iran's periphery. Engagement in the South Caucasus can be seen as part of a wider effort to limit Iranian maneuvering space without escalating to direct confrontation. Yet from Tehran's perspective, This may appear as encirclement, increasing the chances of countermeasures that destabilize the region. This dynamic illustrates a central paradox of modern U.S. strategy. Efforts to project influence without large military footprints are designed to reduce risk and cost. But in regions where multiple powers compete, even limited moves can have amplified geopolitical consequences. The South Caucasus becomes a testing ground for whether the United States can maintain strategic presence through networks and partnerships rather than bases and battalions. It is also important to recognize that the countries of the region are not passive pieces on a geopolitical chessboard. Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia pursue their own interests and balance relationships among larger powers. American engagement provides them with additional options, but it does not eliminate the structural pressures created by geography. For Washington, successful policy requires acknowledging local agency while avoiding the illusion of total control. From a broader perspective, the vice president's visit symbolizes an attempt to integrate the South Caucasus into a flexible architecture of partnerships stretching across Eurasia. The objective is not domination, but positioning, ensuring that the United States remains a relevant actor in key transit zones and political junctions. This aligns with a global strategy focused on competition with major powers while conserving resources. The final assessment is nuanced. The South Caucasus offers genuine strategic opportunities for the United States. Engagement can support European stability, diversify economic corridors, and reinforce American diplomatic presence in a sensitive region. At the same time, the environment is inherently unstable, shaped by overlapping rivalries and historical grievances. For American viewers, the essential takeaway is balance. This visit does not herald a new large-scale commitment, but it does mark a deliberate extension of U.S. strategic reach. The success of this approach will depend on maintaining proportionality, expanding influence without sliding into open-ended responsibility. In the end, the South Caucasus represents a microcosm of contemporary American foreign policy. It is a space where opportunity and risk coexist, where influence must be exercised with restraint, and where the costs of engagement are measured not only in dollars, but in long-term strategic bandwidth. The vice president's trip is a signal that Washington intends to compete in this arena. Whether it can do so sustainably remains the central question.